Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. Today I've got a very special guest that's going to get into some insights here on the Green Party and third parties in general, just a bunch of things. A very fascinating man that I had the pleasure of talking to a little bit ago. His name is Adrián Boutureira. He is the former national political organizer for Jill Stein's campaign in 2016. And Adrián, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent, sir. Hey, so thank you for coming on the show, and let's just kind of jump into it. I know you've got a pretty extensive background. How did you end up being in Texas and working for the Green Party?
Well, this is those types of trajectories that start very early on in your life, I guess, and I won't go into the whole biography, but yeah, I mean, we're formed by our life experiences. And, I was born in Uruguay and, got politicized very early in my life, given, the situation there during, the Plan Condor days and the overthrow, the military coup, which wasn't really an overthrow. It was an extension of the same corrupt system that was on, and which just created a justification for the further persecution of the left. And from that moment onwards, I had my view on what constitutes, one's political reality and how that really affects you. So, I landed with Jill Stein, given my involvement in Latin American solidarity work with Alliance for Global Justice. Jill had been working with my comrade, James Jordan, and he basically said, I know this woman who's coming with us to go to Lima, for the summit, that was the climate summit. And she needs someone who can give her some pointers on Latin American political situations and protocols and so on and so forth. Lo and behold, I ended up talking to Jill and kind of giving her a little bit of coaching for her trip to Lima for about 4 months without even knowing she was Jill Stein, who had run for president, until one day she calls me and she says, Adrián, I got something very important to tell you. It's like, I'm going to run for president again. And I'm like, what do you mean again? It's like, I'm Jill Stein. And I'm like, oh, you're Jill Stein. I voted for you. and so, yeah. So, I worked for the Jill Stein. I stepped it up. I have not necessarily been an active member of the Green Party. I was one of the folks who founded the Green Party here in Austin, back in the late mid to late 90s. But then I left, and we can talk a little bit more about third party politics and the pros and cons of involvement here in the United States around those those struggles. But yeah, so so one thing leads to another, and actually I was Jill's field director, not her political. I became the national political organizer for the Green Party after the Jill Stein campaign ended. And in between, I've done, and this is interesting, the whole idea of international studies and the whole idea of political science is an academic field, and I often talk to young folks about that. It's like, how can for me, I looked at college. I went to Queens College and Hunter College in New York, and at one point I said, this is not necessarily where it needs to be. So, you get involved. When you have it inside of you, you get involved, and from the time I was 12 years old onwards, I've been involved in my understanding of what it needs to be done, in order to advance social, political, and economic justice, and Latin American solidarity, environmental health and justice, and I dabbled in all of that. And so that's a little bit of the background on how I got to be a part of the Jill Stein campaign, and how I've even sort of gotten deeper involved in third-party politics and the Green Party.
Awesome, man. Well, let me, and I definitely want to touch on that, as we talk. But, given your experience in Central and South America, I got a couple things come to mind. Well, first of all, I've always marveled at the persecution of the left in Central and South America. I never understood. I mean, I understood factually, I understood it, I guess, logically as to why, but I never understood why the choice was made to say, for example, a simple example. So we overthrow Allende in Chile and we put in Pinochet. And he's obviously who he was, torturer, everything. But he was friendly to Anaconda Copper. I don't understand why we just couldn't allow Allende to nationalize Chilean copper and allow them to just have their own economy and participate in the world economy. Why do we continually, the United States, participate and say like this, what John Perkins calls a death economy?
Right. Well, Abe, having talked to you already, I understand the rhetorical nature of the question.
Sure.
I know you understand very well.
Yeah.
In other words, and Eduardo Galeano does a wonderful job. I don't know if you remember when Hugo Chavez gave Obama a copy he got up from the table and walked over to Obama and gifted him a book called The Open Veins of Latin America, right, by Eduardo Galeano, which is, I recommend it to your listeners, and it is this fantastic study, perhaps one of the best books written by a Latin American intellectual on the very nature of what you're talking about, U.S. economic imperialism in the Americas, right? In other words, we know that, like you're saying, Abe, it's not just what happened in Chile, right? In other words, let's look at Central America and the role of the United Fruit Company from very early on.
Sure.
In other words, there has not been one single military intervention that we can really identify by the United States in Central America that was not driven by the intentionality of controlling natural resources to the extent of fabricating countries, the fabrication of Panama, right? In other words, so that there could be like control of the canal. The fact that the United States, from very early on in its creation, became kind of a regional, economic negative force in the economies of its neighbors. Starting with the war against Mexico and the theft of the whole of the Southwest. Which we still, there's still the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was never honored, right? All of those lands that were appropriated and stolen have yet to be compensated.
Right.
I think we need to just simply, in some ways, move away from any conspiracy theory because there is none. The facts are there speaking for themselves. And for anybody, what surprises me, Abe, is how short most people fall. People that you would expect to know better in terms of digging deeply into this and disassociating it from some passionate nationalist framing and understanding that the role of the United States has been to actually impose our economic, our hegemony, militarily and economically, across the world. And Latin America is perhaps the most clear example. In other words, the control of, mining, oil, you name it, banking. It's maritime routes.
Right.
We cannot allow, and I'm sorry, I kind of, shifted away a little bit.
No.
I mean, the United States cannot allow, under the present economic system and given the economic interest that our government serves, multinational corporation and international capital, the United States cannot allow to have any government, particularly in Latin America, create an example of nationalized industries at the service of the working class, right? It's almost like, okay, and that is what the key thing is to make sure that no such experiments succeed, right? So you got Allende, he's talking about nationalizing the industry. He's putting people in power that are obviously appointing ministry positions that are clearly going to move the country towards, and the labeling. So people say, okay, well, so that's socialism and this is capitalism. Very basic, right? I mean, it's about how you look, at the interest of your people and how you, as the lead administrator of those countries, like resources, choose to sort of move towards, safeguarding those interests and safeguarding the Commonwealth. capital, leaders that have been there under our tutelage, leaders that have been, put in power by the United States to serve the interests of multinational corporations, have shown what their intentions are, have produced the results that we see across Latin America, one of the richest, continents that in the world in many ways, and there you have countries with poverty levels that are sinful, really, and so and it's not just United States, Britain and France, cannot afford also to have successful governments that actually serve the interest of the people and utilize the natural resources and create relationships of equality and respect amongst nations, to talk about fair trade, right?
Sure.
It's that simple. Being able to say, no, you're not going to come into our country and appropriate all of our natural resources and then hire us to extract your resources for you so that you can enrich yourselves, and you can basically bring this wealth back to the heart of empire, which, they don't even share, that generosity at home.
Oh, no.
They're not even good Romans. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned Britain and France. I mean, Europe in general pioneered the concept of empire to begin with, and it's just colonization, isn't it? You with the United States, it's an interesting experiment because we colonized ourselves by taking the land from the Indians and then later Mexico and just moving to, when we got to the Pacific Ocean, we had nowhere to go. And so we had to invent the Spanish-American War to go somewhere, and to justify going somewhere. I mean, no one has a stomach for war until you create enough symbology and you manufacture consent to go ahead and go into a country, say, for example, as you said, and subjugate the people for, a nickel a day with no bathroom breaks and, while you're extracting the resources out of the ground, or or the commodities, whether it's fruit or coffee or rice. And you hit on a couple things that I wanted to ask you about in the present day regarding Central and South America. I mean, because when I was coming up in the 80s, we didn't have internet, so you had to find alternative papers, kind of a thing. There's no. Yeah. You weren't going to get it on the mainstream news. What you saw was the wholesale slaughter of people, but they never told you why. They never told you why El Salvador was El Salvador. They never really got into that except for the whole idea of, better dead than red. And now you don't hear too much about Central and South America in the news anymore. Now it's all just, really just focused on Venezuela. Has it gotten better in Central and South America? Has Nicaragua been able to make a turnaround? Guatemala, El Salvador, has it gotten better, or is it just we're not hearing about it?
No, it has not gotten better. It has gotten progressively worse. Since we can start with Colombia. I mean, the death toll on labor organizers, farm activists, journalists, in the last 10 years, or maybe, since the negotiations begun, have been worse, than the years in all of the years prior. We're just not hearing about it. Guatemala, there's still ongoing assassinations of organizers and environmentalists and indigenous peoples organizers. A lot of the violent killings that we hear in Mexico that are enshrouded in cartel wars and so on and so forth have been political and with the participation of the state, student organizers, so we're just not hearing about it, but mostly because the tide is turning, towards, serving the interest of empire against through no conspiracy. It's just that, some of the leftist governments that have been in power have made mistakes. There's been a lot of, issues in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, as how effectively, those, supposedly leftist governments have been able to sort of self-organize themselves. And I mean, we're talking about very small economies. We're talking about, There is no longer an international support system, however self-serving that it was, coming out of like a country like the Soviet Union or anything like that. So basically right now, I mean, all of these experiments in trying to implement a new vision for how you manage, your resources and society, especially for countries that are coming from a history of poverty and complete lack of investment in the social infrastructures. It's been very, very difficult for them to succeed. When Hugo Chavez was in power, just basically, similar to what, in some ways Gaddafi was trying to do across Africa, he was trying to create, a self-sustainable Latin American trading bloc, that would exclude the United States. And, he sent, millions and millions of dollars of oil to Nicaragua. And so, lo and behold, Venezuela became, enemy number one of corporate America because, had some of those plans succeeded, I think it would have created an alternative to the sort of dependency, if not outright dominance, of U.S. Capitalist interest in the hemisphere. We can, you would need a whole program on Venezuela alone to understand the complexities of what has happened.
Sure.
I visited Venezuela. I took a delegation of young folks with me. That was about, Chavez was still alive, and we actually got to, meet with him, and I saw a lot of good stuff, and I saw a lot of stuff that really surprised me in some ways, as Chavez was trying to make this transition without ruffling too many people's feathers. And that raises the question, can you actually transform society while you still have, primary, actors in political power that their job is going to be to try to destroy you. This whole idea that, you can move a society without class warfare and without conflict, I think, suits the Western bourgeoisie's kind of cosmic vision rather well. But, what I was watching, I'm like, Hugo, if you don't take some of these folks out of the picture, you know what I mean, in terms of power,
right?
And but of course, he was just trying to navigate. You start to understand a little bit of his background, when it became radicalized from within the military. I think that he was trying to, bring change about, without bringing the wrath of the West upon him, as if somehow, that was going to be achieved by just keeping some of the status quo there and allowing them to continue to sort of, dominate, major sectors of the economy. So that is the whole struggle, about the transition to socialism. How does like an emerging economy, in the global South transitions to socialism, without basically being bombed within the first 2 months for nationalizing all the banks and nationalizing all the industries.
Sure.
And basically saying we're freezing all your assets because you're a bunch of thieves. And it's like, you're lucky that we let you keep your house, man.
Right. Well,
because you're like a.
Well, and then to speak to that point, I mean, Chavez, while I believe his intentions were beyond honorable for the people, but as you said, he was trying to make deals with the old guard. And as such, and this is just my observation, I mean, you were there, you can feel, I'm just asking so that you can answer this question, but it just seems like the programs were sort of ill-advised and not fully formed, because when he passed away, those programs disappeared almost overnight. There was no permanent infrastructure to distribute, to ensure that, jobs were staying in Venezuela, for example, or that the nationalization of the resources were going to continue as he left it. It just seems like as long as he was alive, and he had a hard time in office. Obviously, they tried to take him down a couple of times, but it just seems like he was playing too much ball with the old guard, and the structures that he was working to implement never got fully entrenched. Is that a misread on my part?
No. I mean, it is this sort of deeper question as to the transition to socialism, out of a colonialist construct with a hugely entrenched oligarchy, and all you have is the support of the most impoverished sectors of society as your support, and in his case, the loyalty of the military, which ultimately I think became his primary buffer. Now, we're talking about styles. We're talking about a lot of the ministries were not rattled enough. While I was there was major issues of there were all of this reforms that were made, constitutionally, in recognition of indigenous people's rights and their lands. But out on the field, indigenous people's activists, that were trying to reclaim those lands, and actually, there was never really it reminds me a lot of agreements and the NAFTA, and you create this whole infrastructure that says this is the law, but you need implementation mechanisms, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you cannot have implementation mechanisms when you have left a lot of the status quo intact, and you cannot really rattle that. You cannot really take down that corrupt established status quo without being called a radical, borderline, communist terrorist, right?
Right.
You know what I
Right.
mean? And, So you're caught in this quagmire, and then you have to battle your own background. This is Hero came from a military background. He was not necessarily indoctrinated as a Marxist intellectual. He's basically coming from a very nationalistic, patriotic Simon Bolivar kind of and he's learning as he goes, and he's becoming. But when I was there, you would walk into the Ministry of Health was run by young people. The vibe there was just, my God, you felt your heart accelerated everywhere you went. So young people in charge, getting things done. All of these initiatives. It was complete open and transparency. We organized a rally, in front of the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. That's not the exact name, but it was the ministry that dealt with indigenous people's issues. And you walked in there, and you might as well have been in another era. In other words, the bureaucracy, the treatment, their understanding of what their relationship was to be to the revolution, to the transformation, was not necessarily internalized in that particular ministry, and that was all across, and that's why. The neighborhood councils were created to try to bypass. There were a lot of interesting things that Chavez was trying when he created, a major fund for worker co-ops. Anybody who organized a co-op and wanted to launch some kind of economic initiative, there was federal money available to them. He started sending money directly he encouraged communities to self-organize outside of existing municipality power. So there were all these alternative, sources of power. The university itself, he created an alternative university because he couldn't break the stranglehold of the ruling class in Caracas major university. So he created he took over the buildings, I think, of that had been the headquarters of a major oil company. I forget which one, and he turned it into the People's University. There were some fantastic things going on the ground, but for instance, there were things he wasn't doing. People were getting caught with their hands in the cookie jar.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And instead of going Saudi Arabia on their asses and saying, hey. It's what? No, not here. Not under this process, because now you're taking from the people.
Right.
right? You're not just taking from Exxon. You're not just now you really are hindering the future of several generations that are depending on how we succeed here. So since you're a minister and you were caught taking bribes, you're a minister, you are a top ranking official in my government, I am going to give you 30 years, man, without probation. You're not coming.
Right.
You're not coming out. You know what I mean?
Right.
So no such thing. Hugo would get on he had this Sunday TV program. He would get there. He would do this public chastisement, humiliation thing, very Catholic, the whole damn thing, very military and very Catholic. It's he would name them. These guys would be publicly shamed. They would kind of disappear, you know what I mean? Maybe go and do a month in jail and then disappear to their villa, in somewhere in rural Venezuela, and within a couple of years they were resurfacing, right?
Right.
So that was the huge critique of the young radical left. There was not enough investment in transitioning and creating new leadership. I don't think Hugo, as many of our, best patriarchs, he did not come from an anarchist sort of syndicalist background, right?
Right, right.
He landed straight from being a military guy with good intentions and a nationalist. He was basically, he went straight into Marxist Leninism, and you know what I mean, and he was the man, right?
Yeah.
Now, the work that needed to be done to sort of create, the revolutionary youth brigades, that's what, in the brief conversation that we had, I'm like, what about the idea of creating a revolutionary youth brigades that their responsibility is, they have a free, carte blanche to walk into any ministry and basically, do full-fledged investigations of any corruption. Hardcore shit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You give it some nice uniforms.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's the thing. No, go ahead.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Well,
no, that's kind of, you're speaking to my point, and that's why I'm glad you're answering this question so fully, because a lot of times here in the States, especially when they were having economic problems not long after Chavez died and the economy was kind of falling apart, they blamed it on socialism, quote unquote, but they didn't acknowledge the poor implementation of it. That there was no real structure. You're answering that question completely. I was going to ask you what your thoughts were on Nicolas Maduro, because I know he has not had an easy time of it either, right?
Well, yeah. The transition into Maduro is not Chavez, right?
Right.
Maduro's, oratory power. Maduro's Chavez was a natural. Chavez was for real. He was who he was in earnest, and he himself, was integral. And not to say that Maduro is not integral, but by the time that Maduro took power, some of those holes in Chavez's strategy had begun to sort of, show their negative consequences. Now there were multiple structures that were successful. Again, it's not that Chavez was kind of, functioning in this realm of chaos, where there were incredible programs in place, like some of the ones I cited. The community council, programs, which basically created, the communities themselves would self-organize and they would receive money, and they would no longer have to wait, for the corrupt city to build running water pipes in the favelas, outside of the city of Caracas, right? There were, and I witnessed so many of these things, and man, the spirit of the people, the hope. And I have family in Venezuela, and I had traveled to Venezuela, many times. And the beauty of what I witnessed was to have people who for 4 or 5 generations, have felt nothing but defeated, has felt that they were fixed in this, kind of, cycle of oppression to actually speak like we are in charge now. This is our country, and this is the proof of it. We have these bricks and these pipes, and that we can now start. I mean, that was something that I was too young for what happened in Cuba during the early stages in Cuba. So to me, that was just like something that I had never experienced in my lifetime, what I was witnessing amongst the people, the sense of hope and the sense of empowerment, that a lot of these programs that were very intentional. Now, again, we must remember that the critique will have to be part of an analysis of what every progressive-minded people need to ask themselves out of the Venezuelan experience, in my opinion, is can a transition to socialism happen without a real radical shift in the power structure of the country in transition? Can we actually transition to socialism while leaving some of the, banking institutions and some of the, major industries and even the structures of power still in the hands of the ruling oligarchy, and hope that somehow, you're going to be allowed to survive or accomplish anything? That is the big question for the 21st century socialists, given the fact that, we walked away from the idea of international socialism and armed struggle and basically locking horns. We're in a new era that we need to negotiate and have diplomacy, and there needs to be a big tent where everybody fits. Now, none of the experiments with the big tent have functioned either. So we're dealing with like a huge question for anybody who wants to, stem the tide of self-extinction that we're upon. And increased barbarities all across the world towards a more humane, social, economic, and political, world. We need to ask ourselves, how are we going to do that? I mean, how are we going to, confront, the forces of international capital that are in no way ever going to meet you halfway and say, sure, man,
Sure.
Go ahead and tax us at 75%. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that you can, have proper schools, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
Roosevelt got away with it, because of the war and, but
Well, see,
but that didn't last very
well. Actually,
sorry,
no, I was going to say, you make a point, though, and this is something that, because I liked Roosevelt, and to some degree, I did like Eisenhower quite a lot. The more I learned about his covert stuff, the less I was a fan. But up
Right.
through Eisenhower, the corporate tax rate was 90%. And, I'll have my more conservative friends go, well, how can you like that? I say, okay, first of all, no company pays 90% in taxes. That's the rate if you don't file. Now, when you file with your expenses and everything else, you knock that down to maybe 15 or 20%. The difference compared to now is that the government did get the 15 to 20%. They weren't refunding IBM $500 million, right? So there's a big difference. And for that write-down, corporations like GM, IBM, all the usual suspects, they had to provide proof of, well, they had to invest in infrastructure. They had to invest in plants. They had to invest in pensions. They had to pay for insurance, and they had to pay employees more, and they did because of the unions, to write down that 90%. And then the other thing that occurred, the people, we can never put this genie back in the bottle. Up until 1961, it was illegal to manufacture overseas, and so we had a captive audience. We could sell overseas, which is why we went into the Philippines and Singapore in the 1890s, but we could not manufacture overseas. And then under pressure from big business, Kennedy allowed 5% of American manufacturing to be done overseas. That was a quota. And every president of both parties every year up until 1993 raised that quota such that by the time Clinton came into office, I think the overseas quota was 80% could be manufactured overseas, which then that weakened labor even further, because then if labor went to management and said, hey, we want more money, or we don't want to pay as much on our benefits, the management would say, well, go fuck yourselves. We're going to go ahead and go to China. We're going to go ahead and go to Mexico. We're going to go ahead and go to wherever.
Oh, sure.
And then Clinton came out with NAFTA, which Reagan and Bush couldn't pass. And it literally just put the foot on the gas, going through a car through a plate glass window with the rest of organized labor in this country. So, I don't have a problem with a higher tax rate because businesses always write down. The challenge we have now is, you've got Apple paying 0.005%. You have Walmart with 30 shell companies in Lithuania, with an employee apiece, and we're still paying their benefits to the tune of $30 billion a year because we subsidize their workers. So anyway, but I wanted you to speak a little bit more about, because this kind of gets me into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because I see what you endeavored with Jill and the Greens and everything else. And the nature of third parties in this country, especially like the last 30 years. I mean, we've had some crazy people run, George Wallace and people like that, but we've also had some really credible people run. And it doesn't seem like the third party in this country, by a combination of an American exceptionalism, fear, let's not upset the apple cart, it just seems like the treatment of third parties is almost an American persecution of the left. Is that accurate, or am I off on that?
I mean, partially. I don't think that. The exploitation of fearmongering, has a lot to do with it. And my goodness, I can't imagine what's going to happen in 2020. If the Green Party has been demonized in the past as somehow being an agent of facilitating Republican power by taking votes away from the Democrats, you can only imagine what they're going to do to the party in 2020, as they continue to build the case for Trump, the demented, tragic comic, almost something out of a movie, which he is.
Right.
And so, I mean, a country, it's really exceptional in some way. What I feel, you take a situation like here in Texas, in what was happening here, and basically us telling people, you understand that we need the 5%. You understand that Hillary is not going to win Texas, and that basically you could actually create a situation where you can help protect, democracy, right? Because you cannot have, a real democratic process with two parties. In other words, it's insane to think that the United States really does not have any third-party political alternatives. Even the most corrupt countries in Europe do, which creates all sorts of, opens up a whole set of possibilities. Like in Spain right now, a whole bunch of parties, basically calling for the resignation of the ruling party over a case of corruption, and they might, they're very close to having those votes in their Congress. So we don't have any such thing, and I believe that somewhere along the line, come every election, we are not as concerned as the deep issues of what is democracy, what does a democracy look like, how does my vote, not only get someone elected, but basically help advance and promote a certain value and a certain principle, which ultimately will become manifest in future real democratic access to power.
Right.
Now, I don't. You see, the third parties themselves have not always been clear strategically as to how to basically advance that. I wanted to do a lot more of basically, in Texas at least, I was kind of released from some of my other duties nationally to try to concentrate in Texas so that we do not lose balances, which we did eventually. To be able to say, it's 5% of us people, don't talk to me about democracy. Don't talk to me about how you are worried about democracy in Venezuela, and then basically like vote the lesser of two evils, like a resigned sheep marching off to some
slaughter,
concentration
camp.
To the slaughter. I mean, don't. So challenging people straight on, without necessarily insulting anyone's integrity, but basically, having people assume their historical responsibilities, right? That's not something that Americans do very well, right? In other words, you're talking about before you touched on the fabrication of consent, and it leads you to ask yourself a question. In other words, after Iraq, after Vietnam, after Chile or whatever. I mean, we need to ask ourselves, any American that has half a brain, how in the world can we continue to accept that we, almost in every presidency, we get lured into yet another war, war of conquest, another engage, so. Are we missing something in our synapses? Are they putting something in the water? The chemtrail.
Well, you know what though, but you said something a second ago though that I do want to piggyback on. You said you gave some credit to integrity. In my little micro survey of my friends, of which between Facebook and my personal life, I got a lot, and I was going to vote for a third party. And and don't sue me, but I ended up voting for Gary Johnson, and I'm just what I kept hearing is, why would you vote for Gary Johnson or Jill Stein? I'm like, well, they've got good ideas, and so far we haven't seen any. And this lesser of two evils has been a race to the bottom. I mean, they can't win. Well, they can't win, you fucking idiot, because you don't vote for them. If you would look at their platform, at least get them into the debates, and not this second string shit that CNN did, but to have like a real, a batting around of some serious ideas. I mean, Jill's Green New Deal was not stupid. I mean, it was a good idea. I mean, it was what Barack Obama promised in 2008. I should have known better, but I chose to believe it because I wanted to be 5 years old again. But he was gonna make Detroit the green mecca, remember? And refurbish all these factories and blah 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 blah. And nothing happened. And so when you talk about integrity, I don't see it as integrity. I see it as motivated by fear. No one wants to vote for the quote loser. I'd rather vote my conscience.
Yeah, motivated by fear. It's. I mean, again, there are no conspiracies. There are just like a series of sociological and anthropological and factors that go into the forging of a national psyche.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's a mouthful of fluff. But what I'm trying to get at is I mean. The campaign itself, campaigns themselves don't necessarily, at one point, I was talking to Jill's management, and I'm like, look, we need to come out swinging. In other words, we need to be a lot more aggressive. We need to break away from like trying to make everybody happy, and we need to tell some truths that are going to actually help people, cross that barrier,
right.
Okay, that psychological barrier. So you need to tap into that. And Jill, in my opinion, her disposition, the way she speaks, you have to move people. You have to move people to the, populism works. You know what I mean? Populism has gained a bad rap. You know what I mean? But I believe that you have to understand what it is that the people are requiring in order for you as the politician to move them to that next level. The time for soft, intellectual, soft-spoken, monotone, intellectual, sort of non-combative, non-inflammatory talk may have passed us. In other words, not when the enemy is milking it for all it's worth,
right.
Because it was that kind of, right-wing populism that got Trump the power, because he basically, now we have people on our side that need to hear, even more so, because we can be populists that are armed by the truth, right? And we can be populists that are not trying to convince a whole bunch of white working class people. I mean, the genius of populism, this guy's, convinced millions and millions of like white working class people living out like in complete and sheer poverty out in rural like West Virginia and Tennessee and Alabama, that it was in their best interest to lose healthcare. It was in their best interest to surrender all the power, to corporations, deregulate everything so that, and you know what I mean?
Right.
So they're basically convincing people to go against their own interests, their own class interests. We have the advantage that if we are willing to come out swinging and we're willing to tell people, look, the time for fear is over. The time to be believing the lies that you're being told by the status quo parties, it's over.
Right.
If you really want, schools to function, if you want your children to be able to get an education, you're going to have to, already learn where you've been and take that leap into the future and basically assume leadership. Everywhere I went, speaking on behalf of the party, that's what I was telling people. It's it's a vehicle, people. Just join the party. You know what I mean? If there is corruption there, just clean it up. If things are not getting done, then take the leadership and deliver the goods. But, now, is the Green Party the vehicle for transformation? And I'll be perfectly honest with you, at this point, that's where I am as an individual, at this point in time in my life, asking myself if maybe the Green Party itself has too much baggage now, to actually convince, millions of Americans that we are a legitimate, viable vehicle towards the kind of transformation that is.
But here's
that's also a whole different conversation.
Right, but to speak to that really quick though, the Green Party compared to Hillary Clinton has no baggage. The Green Party is a 17-year-old nun compared to Hillary Clinton, and that's not conspiracy theory. That is conspiracy fact. And so, to speak to what you were talking about as far as populism, absolutely. Listen, why Bernie got traction was because he had the same conviction for the people and the good things that could be done in the name of the people. The same kind of conviction that Donald Trump had, motivating who he motivated, people to vote against their own interests, frankly. And so, but see, and we've got a little bit of time left, so I wanted to kind of touch on a couple of other things. But you definitely hit a point, though, when you're talking about the day of, a soft-spoken intellectual conversation is over. I mean, I've seen, I saw Gary Johnson get smeared over Aleppo. One gaffe in an entire campaign.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump shot himself in the dick 3 times a day. Nothing happened, right? And then you take on the so-called left, people just marginalizing the sins of Hillary Clinton. And then I'm like, listen, if you voted for the Iraq War, that's a disqualifier. Oh, that was a long time ago. Well, tell that to the Gold Star families who lost a kid. Tell that to the 1 million or so Iraqis that we killed, or the 200,000-300,000 Afghanis that we killed. You're talking about
Libya. I mean, her role in Libya.
Yeah. Oh my God! No, and I don't mean Benghazi. When I bring up Libya, still people don't know that we actually invaded Libya. I know people that do not know. They go, "Oh, well, that Benghazi." No. We invaded Libya the same way we did with Iraq, without an exit strategy. And now there's 40 terror groups that control the oil and they sell it on the black market. We got Yemeni slaves now in Libya. Way to go, Hillary. There's women.
Yeah, no. Benghazi became a distraction of empire. To basically we couldn't protect our own people and whatever. It's it's hard to protect your own people when your own people are dismantling and destroying, a whole national infrastructure that, over a fabricated war that the French motivated, out of fear of the gold standard, that Gaddafi was hoping to be able to implement across Africa to replace, the Franc-dominated banking system of most of West Africa, right? And East Africa. So, clearly, again, I worry that, there is this whole new thing, conspiracy theories are really dangerous because they're the part of the problem is that, the best of them will take sort of 10% of fact and truth, and then add 90% that is just such crap and such bullshit that completely confuses anybody. But then they lure people in with the 10% of the factual proof, and then 90% becomes just
but you don't need a complete conspiracy. Legally, a conspiracy is 2 or more people planning something. That's the legal definition of conspiracy. But you don't even need a conspiracy. If you have an actor behaving in its best interest, and that best interest seems to also satisfy the peer group doesn't have to participate. They just have to let the actor get in on it. So if this is when I say conspiracy fact. Yeah, I agree with you. I know some conspiracy theorists that they want to talk about Roswell or whatever, and you're going, okay, dude, that has nothing to do with the economy. I don't give a shit. And Russia doesn't affect my life. It's like high-end gossip. So, and when you look at the quote facts of that nonsense, it's going to probably be tacky Russian money laundering with mobsters. But I wanted to get in. You've been touching on Libya for a little bit because recently. And then I heard today on NPR when I was driving in that they're trying to restart the talks on June 12th in North Korea. And I look at the Libya situation, not unlike the Iraqi situation and what they're trying to do with Iran. I don't blame North Korea. I mean, am I crazy? I don't blame North Korea. And I'm not saying this rhetorically, just to clarify, I want you to say it because you're the expert, but I don't blame North Korea for backing out or having their doubts. So we can go in there and get their $3 trillion worth of minerals that they can't afford to mine because they've been making nukes because we keep buzzing their borders with B-1s. I mean, is it wrong to think that North Korea is not a bad actor? Because frankly, I just think that they're acting in a human defense because every time we've been to Korea in any sort of capacity, it's to threaten them. We killed 2 million of their people in the 50s. Is Kim Jong-un crazy, or is that's just a more American spin?
No, I mean, to me, I am actually wondering, what is he talking, with the South that's making him actually do some things that, I would not be negotiating with this particular U.S. administration to save my life, especially given, what they just finished doing with Iran. I mean, there is no international, other than whatever Netanyahu fabricated, which was, the timing was perfect, that basically allowed for Trump or Trump's administration to say, you see, there is the evidence. So the evidence didn't come from the United Nations and from the people who are actually reviewing and studying the data and actually having a physical presence at the facilities in question. No, the evidence comes from some sort of secret, Israeli intelligence reports that Netanyahu produces, and that suffices for the United States. So, you see, we knew it. So I mean, if the Koreans are looking at that, exactly what it is that they are kind of expecting to get out of this deal. In other words, the only thing I can, for me, in thinking about it, is the North Koreans cannot convince the South Koreans that their intentions are good enough to start working towards U.S. withdrawal from the peninsula. You know what I mean? And then basically come to some sort of internationally, oversight of some sort of peace agreement, which is strengthened further by some solid economic, deals that can prove highly beneficial to the North, so they would no longer feel the motivation to further engage in aggression. I agree with you. I think that the arrogance of the administration and its
hello.
complete lack of interest in abiding by any international law, or even respecting our own best interests. Because I don't particularly trust the Europeans to defy the U.S. marching orders. We already have French companies like Total, saying we're not going to be able to absorb U.S. sanctions, so we're planning to pull out. So, but the Chinese already said that they're not going to have any problems. Whatever Europe and United States want to leave behind, they'll pick it up.
Right.
So, so basically, this is not even the kind of organized capitalist masterminding, that one would have expected, through the 50s and 60s. Right now, we're just doing some stuff that I'm not even sure, what the actual intentionality is.
Okay.
I'm trying to understand what does the, West, gain to earn, by the U.S. pulling out of this, other than just create this atmosphere of global insecurity, to continue to promote armed conflicts, and sort of putting more and more money in the coffers of the armaments industry. So, no, Korea, I'm just very, very curious as to what in the world are they going to be negotiating with the United States. What is the United States going to offer when they're already saying, we're not really going to offer anything,
Right.
I mean, we may help you, but, you guys need to, denuclearize, and that's it. And then we'll talk, once you do that, we'll see what happens. So, Gaddafi, was talked into that, and we know how that ended,
right.
And so did Saddam Hussein. So, it seems like, I don't particularly know, the psychology of the North Korean regime enough, to tell you, that I can predict, what they're after and what they may, want to get. I don't have that very clear right now.
Yeah, I don't think anybody does.
I think that they would prefer, to end this. I can imagine, them, wanting to sustain it, because it's not sustainable. It's a time bomb for themselves eventually.
Right.
No matter how much control you have over your native population, some things are unsustainable. They may not survive the next famine if there is one, right? And so, and the North Korea, but that they met today again, without Trump, right? There was like a surprise meeting between the North and the South.
Yeah, I heard that.
I would love to get some of it's what's surprising to me. A lot of these conversations are being filmed. A lot of when they're walking around, they're being filmed. We need to find some Korean lip readers that can tell us what the hell this guy's talking about. I'm curious. The first conversation that they held when they were crossing the line or whatever, they were talking to each other for like 10 or 15 minutes. Right? And I'm like thinking to myself, somebody has to be like dropping in. What are these guys saying to each other? It's like, shit, how do we get rid? How do we get rid of the Americans?
Well, yeah, so, they're not. It's not like the NFL where they walk around with a clipboard in front of their face so they can talk into the mic. The NFL has lip readers, so it's like Yeah, no. Soccer, the same thing. So these guys are being completely like oblivious. So no, there is this high theater. I don't particularly think that Trump is, sane. I don't think there are too many politicians that are. I can imagine how any human being can actually be sane as the president of the United States, given, all they have to deal with on a daily basis, Sure.
But this guy's particularly
unhinged
out there. And yeah. And so, is he performing? Is he just creating? It's hard for, and he surrounded himself with some rather dangerous people.
Well. John Bolton coming in.
John
Bolton coming in and gumming up the works with this North Korea thing is not a big surprise. John Bolton should be in jail. The guy's a maniac, and he's got a position. Hey, listen, Adrián, we're out of time. I hate to cut this off, but it's been fascinating. I'm so glad you came on and shared your wealth of knowledge and your experience and your background. Folks, this is the kind of stuff that I don't think you're going to hear, unless you're on YouTube or reading The Guardian or The Intercept. This is the kind of thing that I want to try to bring to you people, and if it makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.